rain-soaked city gleamed under broken streetlights, as Henry Donovan, the CEO who'd sworn never again, walked past an alley bathed in sickly yellow light. On a pile of damp garbage, a young woman curled into herself, sleeping, her tangled hair matted against torn cardboard, thin arms clutching a threadbare backpack. Her name was Rosalind, and she'd just been thrown from the only place she'd called home. A gust of wind struck, and she shivered violently. Henry turned to leave. But something in that moment held him. He didn't know this instant would shatter the frozen promise that had locked his heart. The Donovan Holdings Tower pierced the night sky like a blade of glass and steel, its windows reflecting the city's restless pulse below. Inside his 42nd floor office, Henry Donovan stood with his back to the mahogany conference table where 3 folders lay perfectly aligned. At 36, he commanded rooms with the precision of a conductor directing a symphony, every gesture calculated, every word measured. The rain streaked down the floor to ceiling windows, distorting the lights of lesser buildings into watercolor smears. Leon Whitaker, the chief financial officer, cleared his throat from his position near the door. His gray suit matched his demeanor, conservative, cautious, perpetually concerned about shareholder value. Beside him, Serena Hollis, head of legal, tapped her fountain pen against her leather portfolio in a rhythm that suggested impatience. She had the kind of presence that made opposing counsel sweat before negotiations even began. Oliver Hale, the public relations director, scrolled through his tablet with the nervous energy of someone who saw potential scandals lurking in every corner. Henry had just signed the termination papers for their charitable foundation's latest initiative. Inefficient. The metrics had shown. Poor return on investment. The numbers never lied, even if they occasionally left a bitter taste. He watched a homeless man push a shopping cart through the street below, the figure no larger than an ant from this height. Something flickered in Henry's chest, a phantom pain from a wound he'd thought had healed completely. The coffee cup on his desk sat 3 inches from its designated coaster. Such a minor deviation, yet it bothered him. When his assistant had placed it there earlier, Henry hadn't corrected her. Now, as he reached to adjust it, his hand trembled slightly. The liquid sloshed, sending a single drop over the rim. It spread across the pristine glass surface, a small stain in his perfectly ordered universe. He stared at it longer than necessary, this tiny chaos that had infiltrated his controlled environment. The metaphor wasn't lost on him, though he'd never admit it aloud. Order was everything. Control was survival. 3 years ago, Vivian Cross had taught him that lesson when she'd walked away with his competitor and half his executive team's loyalty. Never again, he'd sworn. Never again would he mistake kindness for wisdom or vulnerability for strength. The meeting concluded with the usual efficiency. Serena reminded him about tomorrow's board presentation. Oliver mentioned something about image rehabilitation that Henry only half heard. Leon's parting words about fiscal responsibility echoed in the empty office after they'd gone. Henry remained at the window, watching the rain intensify. The city below writhed in the downpour. And for a moment, just a moment, he wondered what it felt like down there, where the water pooled in doorways, and no one had 42 floors of separation from the storm. Henry's driver, Archie Bellamy, had worked for the Donovan family for 15 years. The man had the discretion of a priest and the reliability of sunrise. Tonight, however, Henry dismissed him at the building's entrance. He needed to walk, to feel the rain on his face, to remind himself that discomfort was just another sensation to be mastered. The October wind cut through his $8,000 coat as if it were tissue paper. 3 blocks from the tower, Henry turned down Madison Street to avoid construction barriers. The detour led him through a narrow alley that reeked of wet cardboard and something metallic, perhaps rust, perhaps blood. The single functioning streetlight cast everything in a jaundiced glow that made even the puddles look diseased. He would have continued without pause, if not for the sound, a whimper so soft it might have been the wind. Against the alley's eastern wall, where the garbage collectors had missed or ignored several bags, a young woman lay curled on a makeshift bed of newspapers and plastic. Her honey-colored hair, darkened by rain and dirt, clung to her face in stringy tendrils. The backpack she clutched looked ready to disintegrate, held together by safety pins and desperate hope. Her wrists, visible where her two short sleeves had ridden up, bore bruises in various stages of healing purple, green, yellow, like a sick sunset painted on skin. Henry's first instinct was to leave. This wasn't his problem. The city had shelters, services, systems in place for such situations. But when another gust of wind tore through the alley, and the woman really just a girl, he could see now, perhaps 21, curled tighter with a sob that she tried to muffle against her arm, something cracked in his chest. The sound was too familiar. Too much like another night. Another alley. Though that one had been in Boston, and the person crying had been him, 16, and thrown out by an uncle who decided one mouth to feed was enough. He shrugged off his coat before his logical mind could intervene. The fabric settled over her shoulders, and she startled awake with the panic of someone who'd learned that unexpected touch rarely meant anything good. Her eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds with hints of silver, like lightning waiting to strike. Recognition flickered across her features, followed immediately by shame. Rosalind Carter knew who Henry Donovan was. Everyone in the city did. His face graced business magazines and charity galas, though the latter had grown less frequent. She tried to sit up, to return the coat, her voice cracking as she apologized for existing in his path. The words tumbled out in a rush she'd leave. She was sorry. She didn't mean to be here. Her aunt had finally had enough and changed the locks while she was at her dishwashing job, and she'd had nowhere else to go. But she'd leave right now if he wanted. Henry heard himself speaking as if from a great distance, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. He pulled out his phone and called Archie, instructing him to bring the car around. When Rosalind protested, Henry noticed how she held her left shoulder dislocated or severely bruised. The emergency clinic on Riverside stayed open until midnight. She needed medical attention, and he found himself unable to walk away from that need. The clinic's harsh fluorescent lights revealed more than the alley's shadows had hidden. Rosalind's face bore the sharp angles of prolonged hunger, cheekbones too prominent, eyes sunken slightly. The doctor, a tired woman named Dr. Patricia Lorne who'd seen too much to be surprised by anything, confirmed the shoulder was badly bruised but not dislocated. She recommended rest, warmth, and regular meals prescriptions that couldn't be filled at any pharmacy. Rosalind sat in Henry's car afterward, his coat still draped around her shoulders, trying to make herself smaller against the leather seats. She insisted Archie could drop her at the subway station. She'd be fine. She'd been fine before, but when she coughed a wet, rattling sound that spoke of nights spent in the cold, Henry made a decision that would have horrified him 3 hours earlier. He gave Archie his home address. The penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a pre-war building that had been gutted and rebuilt with every modern amenity money could buy. The elevator opened directly into a foyer of white marble and abstract art that cost more than most people's homes. Constance Moore, Henry's housekeeper, appeared without being called a skill she'd perfected over her 5 years of employment. If she found it unusual that her employer had brought home a bedraggled young woman who looked like she'd been sleeping rough, her expression didn't betray it. While Constance prepared the guest room, Henry stood with Rosalind in his living room, the space between them filled with the weight of different worlds colliding. The minimalist furniture, all clean lines and neutral colors, seemed to judge her presence. She stood near the door, dripping slightly onto the Italian marble, afraid to contaminate anything with her existence. The bathroom in the guest suite was larger than most apartments Rosalind had lived in. She stood before the rainfall shower, reading the instructions on bottles of shampoo that listed ingredients she couldn't pronounce. The hot water felt like a miracle against her skin, washing away layers of grime and fear. Constance had left clothes on the bed, simple things, sweatpants and a cashmere sweater that felt like wearing a cloud. When Rosalind emerged, Henry was in the kitchen, standing awkwardly beside a tray where Constance had arranged tea and sandwiches. He looked smaller here, in his own space, without the armor of his office and title. She ate slowly, carefully, as if afraid that showing hunger would reveal too much weakness. Between small bites, she noticed things: how his hands moved with precision but occasionally trembled, how he looked at her and then away, as if direct observation might break something. The living room held a massive abstract painting, all grays and blacks with violent slashes of white. Henry had paid $300,000 for it at auction, drawn to its controlled chaos. Rosalind studied it while sipping ginger tea that Constance had insisted would help with her cough. "It looks like the sky before dawn," she said quietly. "That moment when it's not quite night anymore, but morning hasn't figured out how to begin." Henry stared at the painting he'd looked at every day for 2 years. He'd never seen it that way before. Had always interpreted it as endings, not beginnings. The observation unsettled him more than her presence in his home. As the night wore on and exhaustion painted darker shadows under Rosalind's eyes, Henry heard himself asking questions he hadn't planned. She answered with a careful honesty that suggested she had nothing left to lose. Her parents had died when she was 15, car accident, drunk driver who walked away without a scratch. Her aunt had taken her in out of obligation rather than love, reminding her daily what a burden she was. She'd worked whatever jobs she could: dishwasher, cleaner, sometimes 2 or 3 at once. The bruises came from her aunt's boyfriend, who decided that if Rosalind was going to live under his roof, she needed to earn it in ways that made her skin crawl. When she'd finally said no, finally fought back, she'd come home to find her few belongings in garbage bags on the curb. Henry found himself sharing fragments of his own carefully guarded history. The uncle in Boston who'd thrown him out. The nights spent in 24-hour laundromats, pretending to wait for clothes that didn't exist. The scholarship that saved him. The mentor who saw potential where others saw problems. He didn't mention Vivian. That wound was too fresh, even after 3 years. But he spoke of building walls, of learning that success meant needing no one, trusting no one, giving nothing that could be used against you. "That sounds lonely," Rosalind said, and the simple truth of it hit Henry like cold water. "It's safe," he replied, but the words sounded hollow even to him. When Constance returned to check on them, she brought an old wool cardigan. "Nothing fancy," she insisted, "just something she kept in the staff room for cold days." The way she placed it over Rosalind's shoulders was maternal, gentle. It was the first kindness that made Rosalind cry silent tears that she tried to hide behind the teacup. Henry declared that she'd stay the night. Just one night, he emphasized. As much to himself as to her. Until she was well enough. Until the morning came. And reality reasserted itself. Rosalind nodded, understanding the boundaries even as gratitude overwhelmed her. When she stood to go to the guest room, she swayed slightly, and Henry reached out instinctively to steady her. The contact lasted only seconds, but something passed between them. Not attraction, not yet, but recognition. Two people who'd learned to survive alone, suddenly aware of what together might mean. The next morning arrived, wrapped in consequences Henry hadn't anticipated. His phone erupted with calls before 7. Oliver's voice carried barely controlled panic. Someone had captured a blurry photo from a security camera across from the alley. Henry Donovan. Easily identifiable. Bending over what the nascent viral post called a homeless girl. The image was grainy but suggestive, and the internet had already begun spinning narratives. The emergency board meeting convened in the conference room where yesterday Henry had terminated the charity program. Leon's face was purple with barely suppressed rage. The quarterly report was due in 3 weeks. Any scandal, any suggestion of impropriety, could send stock prices tumbling. Serena had already fielded 2 calls from major investors asking if Henry was having some kind of breakdown. "This is what happens when you act without thinking," Leon said, his usual deference abandoned. "We've worked too hard to let your sudden bout of conscience destroy everything." Serena was more surgical in her approach. The legal ramifications alone could be significant. If this girl decides to claim anything inappropriate happened, if she sees $signs, "Nothing inappropriate happened," Henry cut in, his voice sharp enough to draw blood. Oliver held up his tablet, showing trending hashtags that made Henry's stomach turn. "We need a statement. Either she was a professional escort, which we can spin as a personal matter, or she's a human being who needed help." The words came out harder than Henry intended. The room fell silent. Leon and Serena exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their concerns for Henry's mental state. Oliver typed furiously, probably drafting contingency plans for every possible scenario. "You have 48 hours, Leon finally said, "to make this disappear. Otherwise, we'll need to discuss limiting your public-facing role." The board won't tolerate another Vivian situation. The mention of her name was calculated, cruel, and effective. Henry's jaw clenched, but he nodded. After they left, he stood at the window again, looking down at the city that suddenly seemed closer than before. When he returned to the penthouse, he found Rosalind dressed in her own clothes, now clean and dried. She'd folded Constance's cardigan with military precision, leaving it on the perfectly made bed. Her backpack sat by the door, and she stood beside it like someone awaiting execution. "I saw the news on my phone," she said quietly. "I'm sorry. I'll leave now. And I won't say anything to anyone. I promise." Henry studied her face, searching for signs of calculation, for any hint that this was orchestrated. He found only resignation and a sadness that seemed bone deep. She'd already written him a note. He could see it on the entry table, her handwriting careful despite everything. He picked it up after she left, Archie driving her to a shelter she'd insisted would take her. The note was simple. "Thank you for reminding me what it feels like to be seen as a person. I hope your world doesn't punish you for that kindness." Henry held the paper for a long time, feeling its weight exceed its physical properties. His phone buzzed with Oliver's latest strategy, but he didn't read it. Instead, he looked at the abstract painting, seeing for the first time what Rosalind had seen, that liminal space between ending and beginning, where anything might be possible. The Sheffield housing project sat on the edge of the city like an afterthought, the kind of place people drove past with their doors locked. Henry was there to evaluate it for demolition. The land was worth 10 times what the buildings were, and Donovan Holdings had plans for luxury condos that would transform the neighborhood. He walked through the courtyard with his acquisition team, taking notes on structural damage that would justify their plans. A flash of honey-colored hair caught his attention. Rosalind stood near a broken fountain, breaking a sandwich in half to share with 2 children whose clothes suggested they'd been wearing them for days. She didn't see him, focused entirely on making sure the kids ate slowly, didn't choke in their hunger. When it started to drizzle, she used a piece of rope to tie a tarp to the playground equipment, creating a small shelter. Her movements were practiced, efficient, someone who'd learned to make nothing into something. An elderly woman approached Rosalind with a bag of cans. Most people would have seen trash. Rosalind saw resources, helping the woman sort them for recycling, the kind that would bring a few dollars. When the woman's bag tore, Rosalind used strips from her own shirt to repair it, leaving her garment even more tattered, but the woman's dignity intact. Henry watched this quiet choreography of survival and grace, something shifting in his chest. Here was someone with nothing, giving everything, while he sat in boardrooms deciding how to extract maximum value from minimal investment. The contrast was stark enough to hurt. When one of the children hugged Rosalind, leaving dirty handprints on her clothes, she hugged back without hesitation, without regard for the stains. His acquisition manager was saying something about timeline and permits, but Henry wasn't listening. He was watching Rosalind notice him, seeing the surprise, and then the careful neutrality that crossed her features. She didn't approach, didn't acknowledge him beyond a slight nod. She understood boundaries, understood that their worlds weren't meant to intersect. But Henry found himself walking over anyway, his team trailing behind in confusion. The conversation was stilted, formal. Rosalind thanked him again for his help. Henry heard himself offering her work temporary, he emphasized. The Sheffield project needed someone to coordinate the transition services, help residents find new housing before demolition. It was a real position with real pay, not charity. Oliver could manage the optics. 1 month, maybe 2. Long enough for her to save for a deposit on a room somewhere. Rosalind's pride warred with her pragmatism. She negotiated not salary, but responsibilities. She wanted to ensure the residents were treated fairly, that they had adequate time and resources to relocate. She spoke with a quiet authority that surprised Henry, revealing a sharp intelligence that circumstances had never allowed to flourish. When she finally agreed, it was with conditions that protected others more than herself. The arrangement began with careful professional distance. Rosalind arrived early, left exactly on time, and documented everything with a thoroughness that would have impressed Serena. But Henry found himself visiting the Sheffield site more often than necessary. He watched her work, how she remembered every resident's name, how she connected families with resources they didn't know existed, how she mediated disputes with a diplomacy that his Harvard-educated negotiators could learn from. One evening, he found her in the community center they'd set up, teaching a group of teenagers how to fill out job applications. She'd stayed 3 hours past her paid time because one of them had an interview the next morning and needed help preparing. When Henry offered to pay her overtime, she looked at him as if he'd missed the entire point. "Some things aren't about money," she said, and the simple truth of it echoed in his sleepless nights. The first meal they shared outside of work happened by accident. A food truck had broken down near Sheffield, and the owner was giving away inventory rather than let it spoil. Rosalind convinced Henry to help serve, and somehow they ended up sitting on a crumbling wall, eating tacos while the sun set over the city. She laughed when sauce dripped on his $1,000 shirt, and the sound was like windows opening in a house that had been closed too long. The viral photo surfaced on a Tuesday. Someone had taken an image of Rosalind at a grocery store, carrying a bag of items. The angle and quality suggested deliberation, and the accompanying post claimed she'd been shoplifting. Within hours, the narrative exploded. Henry Donovan's charity case was a thief. The comment sections filled with vicious speculation about what else she might be stealing, particularly from Henry. Serena arrived at Henry's office with printed screenshots, her expression grave. "This needs immediate action. Distance yourself now, or risk everything we've built." Leon was more direct. "Fire her. Today. Make a statement that you were deceived, that you'll be more careful with corporate charity going forward." Oliver had already drafted 3 versions of a press release, each one painting Rosalind as either a cunning manipulator or a pitiful failure. But either way, someone Henry had misjudged. Henry stared at the photo, his mind cataloging details others had missed. The timestamp showed late evening. The bag contained bread and milk basics, nothing frivolous. Rosalind's expression was tired, not furtive. He'd seen that exact exhaustion on her face when she worked late at Sheffield, making sure no family fell through bureaucratic cracks. "Find the store," he told Oliver. "Get their security footage." "That's not the point," Leon began, but Henry's expression silenced him. The truth emerged through Constance's quiet investigation. She'd recognized the store. It was owned by Louisa Bridget, who ran a small market near Sheffield. One phone call revealed everything. Louisa had been giving Rosalind expired, but still edible food to distribute to Sheffield residents. The theft was charity, twisted by malicious intent into scandal. But truth traveled slower than lies. The damage was spreading, and the board called an emergency meeting. The ultimatum was clear. Either Henry distanced himself from Rosalind immediately, or they'd invoke emergency provisions to limit his authority. The company couldn't afford another scandal. Another sign of instability. Stock prices had already dipped 2% on speculation alone. Henry found Rosalind clearing out her desk at Sheffield. She'd already written her resignation, trying to spare him the necessity of firing her. Her face was composed, but her hands shook as she packed her few personal items. "It's better this way," she said, not meeting his eyes. "You've done more than enough. I won't let them use me to hurt you." She left before he could respond, vanishing into the city that had swallowed so many like her. Henry stood in the empty office, holding her resignation letter. At the bottom, she'd sketched something, the abstract painting from his apartment, but with rays of light breaking through the darkness. Underneath, in her careful handwriting, "I still believe the dawn comes." That night, Henry sat in his penthouse, staring at the original painting. Constance brought him coffee he didn't drink. Archie called to ask if he needed anything. Even Oliver sent a message, suggesting they could weather this storm if Henry just played along. But all Henry could see was Rosalind dividing her sandwich with hungry children, using pieces of herself to hold together someone else's dignity. The shareholders' meeting was scheduled for Thursday. Oliver had prepared a careful script that acknowledged Henry's momentary lapse in judgment while reaffirming his commitment to fiscal responsibility. The board expected compliance, a return to the Henry Donovan who'd built an empire on calculated risks and cold efficiency. But Wednesday night, Henry made a different choice. He called Margaret Sterling, the most influential financial journalist in the city, and offered her an exclusive. Not the sanitized version Oliver had crafted, but the truth, all of it. Thursday morning arrived. with Henry standing at a podium before 300 shareholders and a dozen cameras. Oliver stood to his left, his face pale as Henry set aside the prepared remarks. Leon sat in the front row, his expression cycling between rage and disbelief. Serena had her phone out, probably already calculating legal strategies. Henry began with the night in the alley. He painted the picture with unflinching honesty. The rain, the garbage, the girl who'd been thrown away by a world that measured worth in profit margins. He spoke of his own past, the nights he'd spent cold and hungry, the mentor who'd taken a chance on him when logic dictated otherwise. He displayed the evidence on the screen behind him, Louisa Bridget's testimony, the security footage showing Rosalind distributing food to families, receipts proving she'd used her own meager salary to buy supplies for Sheffield residents. The scandal crumbled under the weight of facts, but Henry didn't stop there. He talked about watching Rosalind work, about learning that sometimes the best investment isn't the one with the highest return, but the one that reminds you why returns matter at all. He spoke of Sheffield, not as a development opportunity, but as a community that deserved better than displacement. I've spent 3 years saying never again to vulnerability, to trust, to anything I couldn't control, Henry said, his voice carrying across the silent room. But I've learned those words can mean something else. Never again will I mistake net worth for self-worth. Never again will I let fear of loss prevent me from doing what's right. Never again will I build success on the foundation of others' suffering. The room erupted. Some shareholders stood to leave. Others applauded. Leon was on his feet, invoking bylaws and threatening legal action. But Margaret Sterling's fingers were flying across her tablet, and within minutes, the story was live. The real story. The market's response was swift and unexpected. Donovan Holdings' stock price, rather than crashing, surged 3% within hours. Emails flooded in from investors who saw Henry's humanity as strength, not weakness. A generation of younger stakeholders, tired of soulless corporations, rallied behind this new vision. Henry found Rosalind at St. Mary's Church, where she was helping serve dinner to the homeless. She wore the same clothes she'd had on in the alley that first night, now patched and clean. When she saw him, she didn't run, didn't hide. She just continued ladling soup, as if CEOs showing up at church kitchens was perfectly normal. He waited until the line was served, then approached with the humility of someone who'd finally understood the assignment. The conversation was quiet, witnessed only by empty pews and stained glass windows that painted them both in colored light. "You changed me," Henry said, the words simple and overwhelming. "No," Rosalind replied, meeting his eyes fully for the first time since that night in his apartment. "You chose to change. That's different. That's everything." Henry presented his proposal with the same precision he'd use for any business deal. Except, his hands shook, and his voice carried something that hadn't been there before: hope. The Dawn Foundation, he'd calling it. A comprehensive program for displaced individuals, focusing on women escaping abuse. Not charity, but investment in human potential. He needed someone to run it. Someone who understood the population because they'd lived it. Rosalind listened, asked pointed questions about structure, funding, accountability. She'd learned things at Sheffield, about bureaucracy and systems, about how good intentions could pave roads to nowhere if not properly managed. Her conditions were specific: transparent operations, no poverty tourism, no using recipients for photo opportunities. Real help, measured in changed lives rather than tax write-offs. When she finally agreed, it wasn't with enthusiasm but with the careful hope of someone who'd learned that dreams were luxuries she couldn't afford. But when Henry extended his hand to shake on it, she took it, and neither pulled away immediately. The contact was professional, but charged with possibility. The Dawn Foundation launched 6 months later in the renovated Sheffield Community Center. The building that was meant to be demolished became the cornerstone of something new. The opening ceremony drew media attention, but Henry kept his speech brief. This wasn't about him. Rosalind spoke instead, addressing the packed room with the quiet authority she'd developed. She talked about dignity, about the difference between handouts and hands up. Behind her, a presentation showed the foundation's first 100 participants. People who'd found jobs, homes, stability. The numbers were impressive, but the faces were everything. Constance had volunteered to teach life skills classes. Archie drove foundation members to job interviews in his off hours. Even Oliver, surprising everyone, had developed a media training program to help participants tell their stories without being exploited. The corporate culture at Donovan Holdings shifted, imperceptibly at first, then undeniably. Leon eventually came around, especially when the quarterly reports showed that companies associated with social responsibility saw 7% better returns over 5 years. Serena drafted legal frameworks that became models for other corporations attempting similar programs. What had started as crisis had transformed into competitive advantage, but the real change was in the small moments. Henry attending graduation ceremonies for foundation members who'd earned their GEDs. Rosalind in the boardroom, arguing passionately for program expansion, her voice carrying the authority of lived experience. The two of them working late, sharing Chinese takeout while reviewing applications. Their professional relationship deepening into something neither quite dared name. The moment finally came on a rain-soaked evening that mirrored that first night. They stood in the alley where they'd met, now cleaned and lit with proper streetlights, a foundation project. Henry had brought her there to show the transformation, but standing in that space, all pretense fell away. "I love you," he said, the words escaping before his careful control could stop them. "Not because you changed me, not because you saved me from myself, but because you showed me that never again could mean never again being alone." Rosalind's response was to kiss him, there in the alley that had been their beginning. With the rain falling and the city lights reflecting in puddles that no longer looked diseased but simply like water catching light. When they pulled apart, she was crying and laughing simultaneously. "I love you too," she said, "but if you think this means I'll go easy on you in board meetings, you're mistaken." He laughed a real laugh, the kind he hadn't produced in years, and pulled her close. A year later, the Foundation's second anniversary gala filled the grand ballroom of the Marriott. Henry stood at the podium, looking out at 500 faces, donors, participants, skeptics who'd become believers. Rosalind sat at the head table, wearing a simple black dress she'd bought with her own salary, refusing his offers of designer wear. She caught his eye and nodded. That small gesture containing entire conversations. 2 years ago, Henry began. I believed never again meant closing yourself off, protecting yourself from disappointment, from betrayal, from hurt. I built walls so high that no light could enter, and I called that safety. He paused, finding Rosalind's gray eyes in the crowd. But I learned those words could mean something else entirely. Never again will we allow people to fall through cracks while we have the power to build bridges. Never again will we measure someone's worth by their circumstances rather than their character. Never again will we choose the safety of isolation over the risk of connection. The room erupted in applause, but Henry only saw Rosalind, who was standing now, tears streaming down her face. Later, as they danced to a simple piano melody, she whispered in his ear, "You know that painting in your apartment?" "Our apartment," he corrected. And she smiled. "I saw it again yesterday. It's not about the moment before dawn anymore. Now it looks like the moment after when the light has won, but the darkness makes it more beautiful by contrast." Henry thought about that painting, about how perspective could transform meaning, about how a thrown-away girl, sleeping in trash, had become the executive director of a foundation that had helped 3,000 people find stability. He thought about his own transformation, from a man who'd sworn off vulnerability to someone who'd discovered that the greatest strength was admitting weakness. The rain had stopped outside. Through the ballroom's tall windows, the city sparkled with the kind of light that only comes after storms. Constance was teaching a participant's daughter to waltz. Archie was deep in conversation with a young man who'd just gotten his commercial driver's license. Oliver was live-streaming testimonials, having become the Foundation's fiercest advocate. As the evening wound down, Henry and Rosalind stood on the balcony, looking out at the city that had been both their battlefield and their salvation. Her hand found his, their fingers interlacing with the ease of long practice. Below them, the streets that had once seemed so far from his 42nd-floor office now felt like extensions of home. "What are you thinking?" Rosalind asked. Henry considered the question, then pulled her closer. I'm thinking that sometimes the best things come from the worst moments. That painting in our living room, I bought it because it reminded me of chaos I'd controlled. Now I keep it because you taught me to see the dawn in it." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they stood in comfortable silence, two people who'd found each other in the darkness and chosen to walk toward light together. The Dawn Foundation's logo glowed on the building across the street, a sun breaking through clouds, a promise that no matter how dark the night, morning always comes for those who wait together. In his pocket, Henry carried two things: his phone with its endless demands and schedules, and the note Rosalind had left that first morning, now soft with handling. He pulled out the latter, reading her careful handwriting in the light from the city below. "Thank you for reminding me what it feels like to be seen as a person." "Thank you," he said quietly, "for showing me how to see." The city hummed its endless song around them, sirens and laughter, tears and triumphs. Millions of stories intersecting and diverging. But in that moment, on that balcony, two people who'd begun in an alley with nothing but pain between them stood together with everything ahead. The rain had washed the streets clean, and tomorrow would dawn with new challenges, new opportunities to choose love over fear, connection over control, hope over the safer bed of cynicism. Never again would they walk alone.